No.
Please don't do that here. In Franco Zeffirelli's amazing film from the early 70s with the soundtrack by Donovan, if you remember Donovan, there's this young Francis of Assisi attending Mass, as you saw with all of the other wealthy families in Assisi, when he can't help but notice the wretched poor and the ill people who are standing or lying down in the back, and the disparity of the rich and poor in a house that is supposed to be God's temple causes him to reach a turning point. Francis of Assisi, who was born and raised in a wealthy and privileged and religiously observant family, stops the service, just stops it. And he walks outside before the entire town, including the local bishop and his parents, who have followed him outside, and he strips off all of his clothes, and he gives them back to his parents before walking out naked into the mountains to live among the poor as a beggar. Francis is responding to a call that has troubled him ever since he returned ill with a fever from his adventures in fighting in a war between two petty nobles. And his life before the war just no longer makes any sense to him, and he feels that his soul is just being pulled toward a different way of living, a more radical giving up of everything that would have been easily his, a turning aside from the comfortable path that had been laid out before him. His renunciation is a way of giving up that privilege that he reckons was bestowed upon him unfairly. And so Francis is not only ill, his heart is hungry. He is thirsty, and he is lost. And his conversion experience came in the midst of suffering and anxiety. He had an inner sense that something just wasn't right. Not just not right with himself, of course, but with the culture around him and who got and who didn't get. A UCC theologian, Catherine Matthews, writes, "The rich man in this week's passage from Mark does not appear to be similarly afflicted, although he too is apparently nagged by a deep sense that something isn't quite right. It's not quite complete about his life." This is no adversary who is questioning Jesus. The religious authorities aren't in the scene expressing their opinions or trying to trap Jesus. Matthew says, "I used to think this man was arrogant because he so easily claimed to have followed all of the commandments since childhood. Where was his own sense of humility? And who can possibly follow all of the commandments and not make a few major mistakes along the way?" Has anyone had a little difficulty with any of the commandments at one time? I thought I was alone up here, so thank you. Today, we might call the rich man in Mark's story a seeker. And I think that's easy to relate to because I consider myself a seeker. I don't know about you. I suspect we're all pretty much seekers in this room, although we assume that most seekers have not necessarily been paying much attention to religious laws and requirements. But what if there are many seekers already sitting here in our own congregations among us? What if there are people in our seats and even among our church leaders who sense that there is something more, that we are called to something higher, something better than what we have now, and that just doing what is expected of us isn't enough? What if some of you today, creatures of the same privilege that Francis had, because, we're dressed in good, clean clothes, and we have full stomachs, and we have a roof, I presume, not always, over our heads. What if you might be seeking a higher meaning in your own lives? Yesterday, Steve put on a program for us here, and some of us gathered to hear from experts in their field as they talked about homelessness, LGBT, healthcare, nonviolent techniques for action and immigration and hate crimes, and some seekers of a just world for all talked about nonviolent resistance and assistance to people when they are being victimized by hate speech. And we heard about tools for effective communication with policymakers. There are national and there are issues, and there are faith values issues. So how do we balance in our churches these two things? And this is why it's important for us today to be involved in policy issues, because they affect everyone. The folks at the back of the cathedral on the floor, and the ones in the great clothes up front. To help our nation live up to the values we profess to be important to the keeping of a healthy soul, we always need to be in discussion about these things that comes down to policy that benefits everybody and not just some. Francis turned around in church, and discovering the economic disparity between the rich and the poor, which grows sharper, as we know, every year, showed his determination to end this disparity by renouncing his privilege. It is the same thing that Jesus told the wealthy young man, "You lack one thing. Go, sell everything you own, and give the money to the poor. And you," he says, "will have treasure in heaven, and then come and follow me." And when he heard this, he was shocked, and he went away grieving, for he had many possessions. Is anyone going to go out of here today and sell everything that you own? I'm not going to do it. So what a hypocrite am I? And we, Carl and I, just sold our cabin, our beloved cabin of 30 years. It's going to close in a couple weeks, and it is full of possessions. And if any of you have ever had a second home, you know that really all it is giant extra closets so that you don't have to get rid of the stuff that you have at home. You just put it there. We spend half of our lives collecting things, and we spend the second half of our lives getting rid of them. Like Francis, though, he had this inner sense that something was not quite right. So what if even within the church we are still hungering for grace? What if church-going Christians still feel a deep need for transformation in their lives? If we won't sell everything that we own and follow Jesus, if our love of possessions keep us chained to things, then what is it that a seeker today will agree to undertake on a more doable level? Because that's probably the best we got. At our last Synod, a new campaign was introduced. It was called 3 Great Loves. And our UCC president, John Dorhauer, wrote, 3 Great Loves is a response to our newly articulated purpose and mission and vision statement. And it reads like this. First, we will love the Lord our God with our whole heart, mind, soul, and strength, and our neighbor as ourselves. Purpose. United by the Spirit and inspired by God's grace, we will love all, welcome all, seek justice for all. Mission. But the vision is a just world for all, not some, but for all. And he says that these words are intended to articulate why the United Church of Christ is called by God into being. And unless we can operationalize them into mission that matters, they're just words. And so therefore he says, we are inviting and calling the United Church of Christ into mission. We are challenging, he says, the entire denomination, which means each of our churches, to engage in these 3 great loves. The loves are the love of God and neighbor, the love of children, the love of creation. And every church, every setting in our United Church of Christ is invited to make two commitments, which are, first, to discover ways in which we can engage the members of our own faith community in mission and service that serves the need of our children, responds to the suffering of our neighbor, and honors the call to be good stewards to God's creation, this earth. And second, to find a way to narrate the impact of our commitment and tell the story to the rest of our churches that says we're doing these things because they are important. They're important to the continuation of our planet. They are important to our children, our grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And so we'll ask, what will our story be? Dean Watson is the dean of the United Theological Seminary, and he argues that in a world where there were only two classes, the super rich and the impoverished, those who had wealth enjoyed it at the expense of those who went without. Watson sees the rich man as benefiting, intentionally or not, from the suffering of others, much like St. Francis discovered one day during the Mass. And Catherine Matthews says, "We know that care of the poor and a just sharing of the resources at the heart of the prophet's proclamation throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, and yet we so easily slip into the same assumption about wealth and possessions being a sign of God's favor that our ancestors held. In other words, we deserve. It sounds like a prosperity gospel to me." And then Watson claims that the rich person must make amends for the way his wealth has come at the expense of other people, and the lesson is still applicable today, even in very different economic and cultural conditions, because those who enjoy an excess of material things surely have a responsibility toward the millions of people who go hungry and homeless. It's a difficult passage, and not just for the camels. And by the way, the preachers of the gospel story have tried to work with the difficult teaching in a way that makes it more accessible and if not more palatable. If the eye of the needle, here I go, this is a camel analogy. How many camels through the eye of a needle analogies have you heard? But I like this one. The eye of the needle in the wall of a city on an upper floor means an archer can shoot out, but risks very little of being shot back in return. On the ground floor, this needle is wide enough for people to get through, maybe a little more than one person, but in case of a war or an onslaught, with only that one access, they could be easily defeated. And so if the eye of the needle in the wall of the city is reduced to an uncomfortable maneuver by a camel, getting and being a part of a culture that tries to be followers of Jesus may be difficult, but certainly it's not impossible. And so we'll just have to work, I guess, just a little harder at it, because we are overachievers in this congregation. I think we know that. There's something always going on, and there's something going on right after church.